Thanks, Arash. I'd like to thank the organizers of this really fascinating and important um, symposium on Darwin Day 2024 in Iran. I'm really honored to be here, especially among such uh, a prominent group of researchers. So we've heard a fair amount about hominin origins, the origins of the human lineage, but not so much about what happened before. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems, some of the controversies that arise with alternative hypotheses. Hominins are hominines, that is to say, African apes and humans, the African ape and human lineage, are long thought to have originated and evolved exclusively in Africa, and there has been some resistance to the suggestions that some of these events may have occurred in Europe. I think this is in part related to the prevailing African birthplace paradigm, some of which was touched on in previous talks. So I'm going to review some of the current evidence of hominin origins and a little bit about the history of this debate. But before I do that, I want can you see my cursor? I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but at any rate, in this title image, I'm on the left is Rudopithecus, which is a well-preserved, actually beautifully preserved, unusually well-preserved skull from Hungary of Dryopith Rudopithecus that I'll talk a little bit about. In the middle is Anadaluvius, which was recently described from Turkey, and I'll talk a lot more about Anadaluvius, really the focus of this presentation. And on the bottom are a mandible of Gracopithecus from southern Greece, and two views of a single tooth of Gracopithecus from Bulgaria. And then here, I won't talk much about it, but just to remind people, there is also some evidence of hominin bipedal presence. Actually, we don't know what taxon, but the presence of a bipedal ape in the Mediterranean at about 5.7 million years old. But I won't really be talking much about that, trachelose footprint. All right. Oh, no, I have to do it here, I guess. Yeah. So we heard this quote earlier from Don Johansson, and it's the first part of the quote in black is what is by far most commonly cited portion of this quote from Darwin, essentially saying that because humans are closely related to African apes more so than to orangutans, and because African apes live in Africa, humans probably arose in Africa as well. Very logical. But Darwin himself, the very next sentence, says it is useless to speculate on this subject because he knew about actual fossil evidence, the evidence of a great ape from Europe called Dryopithecus, the Dryopithecus of Lachte, which is a funny way of saying that Dryopithecus described by uh, Edouard Lachte in 1856, which seems to be possibly related to apes that live in Africa. And because he recognized also that dispersals or migrations between the great regions of the world and the immensity, the depth of time was so profound that there's no reason to think that the ancestors of African apes and humans might not be something related to Dryopithecus. So right from the beginning, Darwin in 1871 recognized that there were alternative explanations, one of an African origin, but another one of a possibly European origin. So I'm going to explore those two competing hypotheses. This is probably the most comprehensive hypothesis or research and phylogeny promoting the first of Darwin's two alternatives, the African in situ hypothesis. And it was published, and it's an excellent piece of research that I fully endorse. as excellent, although I disagree with some of the results, by Kelsey Pugh in 2022. And the key here is that Kelsey finds that the taxon in this yellow oval, Nacalipithecus, which is from Africa, she finds that this is closely related to these taxa here called the Gryphopiths, which are all from the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia. Oranopithecus macedoniensis, Oranopithecus turci, which we recently renamed Anadaluvius turci, and I'll explain why in a few minutes, and Gracopithecus. So these guys are all in the lineage leading to African apes and humans. Um, and again, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the African ape and human lineage is on the left. Nacalipithecus, which is from Africa, is said to be the ancestor of all of these taxa. So the key here is that these taxa originate from an ancestor in Africa, and that the Oranopithecus group, the Gracopiths, are one group that wandered into Europe essentially and then went extinct. The other alternative, as reflected in these arrows, is that Nacalipithecus is not part of this lineage, but is instead a more primitive taxon. It belongs to this group that we call the stem hominids, which are great apes before the branching of the orangutans, which are in black here, and the African apes and humans, which are in violet or whatever that color is. So that's key, because if Nacalipithecus is among the hominins, the African apes and humans, then it suggests an African origin. But if Nacalipithecus is back here among the stem great apes, the great apes that lived before the orangs and the African apes diverged, then it suggests an alternative hypothesis. It's too primitive to be directly associated with African apes and humans. The other big difference uh, uh, in this branching pattern, and I emphasize that she uses the traditional, extremely widespread way of representing these as branches, are these guys here in this. So if you can see them towards the bottom of the image, Dryopiths in this parentheses filled in with green. Um, these are the European great apes that she considers to be stem great apes before the divergence of orangs and African apes and humans, but that we have determined, and I'll show you this in the next slide, are actually belong here with the Oranopiths, with the Gracopiths, sorry, with the African apes and humans. So there's a difference in interpretation. Uh, but this difference in interpretation is fairly profound because it results in the logical conclusion, on the one hand, that African apes and humans evolved in situ, evolved um, in place in Africa, versus the hypothesis that the African ape lineage actually first evolves in Europe and then moves into Africa. Oops. So here's the next hypothesis. And I like this. This is actually the first time I've tried to represent these things this way. I haven't gotten any feedback on it yet, but these are pools, which I think are analogous to gene pools or populations. And you can see we have a lineage in this light blue here on the left that includes, or a group of taxa, not a lineage, a group of taxa that includes Nacalipithecus as something that is pre orang African ape divergence. And then there are two main lines that evolve. So in these orangey pools, we have the ancestors lower down of the orangs, leading to various orang lineages, and then culminating um, or not culminating, but the only living member of this radiation of orang-like taxa is the living orangutan or pongo. And then on the other hand, further towards the right, we have these green uh, pools with the Dryopithecines. So the ones that Kelsey Pugh thought were more primitive, our conclusion is that they are actually in the African ape and human group. They lead to the Greek, the Balkan and Southwest, the Balkan and Anatolian taxa, Grecopithecus, Anadaluvius, and Uranopithecus, which eventually leads to the separate lineages of gorillas, chimps, and humans. Probably those lineages having evolved indeed in Africa, but having come from an ancestor in Europe. Whoops, skipped a slide there. Okay. Why are there these differences in these interpretations? Sometimes they can be controversial. Is it confirmation bias? Is it that, as the poet Ralph Hodgson said, some things have to be believed to be seen? Or are we smarter than that? And is it just that we need more fossils? I hope it's the latter. I do have to say, though, that if these fossil samples that are from Western and Central Europe that look like African apes, if they had been found in Africa, I think that few people would doubt that they were hominid. Yeah, but they're found in the wrong place. They're found in Europe. Admittedly, though, they are fragmentary, and there is definitely room for alternative interpretations. Common critiques of the hypothesis that I'm going to present, that the hominines, the African ape and human lineage actually evolved in Europe, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, we don't have any convincing hominin, African ape and human ancestor fossils in Africa, but that's because Africa is such a big place, it's relatively unexplored, and eventually we will find them. That's an actual critique. To me, that's not satisfactory because basically they're saying, well, you have a nice idea, but eventually we'll find evidence to prove it wrong, so we're going to reject it. I don't think that's the way science really is supposed to work. The African birthplace paradigm is a large part of this trend, or this tendency by some anyway, to dismiss the evidence from outside of Africa. And then homoplasy is a commonly cited critique. And we heard a little bit about homoplasy from Bernard Wood's really fascinating talk yesterday. Homoplasy is a confounding issue in phylogeny reconstruction, but for me, it's actually a wonderful phenomenon because it's one of the things that Darwin actually used to help explain and legitimize the concept of evolution. The fact that similar ecological or environmental conditions would lead to similar outcomes in organic evolution. But homoplasy in this case is used to say things like, well, the African ape morphology that you see in European fossil apes, it could have evolved independently. And of course it could have. But that's an ad hoc reaction, usually not supported by a lot of evidence, that I think is better to avoid. I do very much agree with Bernard Wood and our colleague Terry Harrison, who in 2011 wrote, "We urge researchers, teachers, and students to consider published phylogenetic interpretations of these taxa as among a number of possible interpretations of the evidence." And I agree fully with that. The phylogeny proposed by Kelsey Pugh and our phylogeny are among a number of possible interpretations of the evidence based on published phylogenetic reconstructions. Later on in this really interesting article, they add that there's no reason why higher primate evolution in Africa, and I added Eurasia, in the past 10 million years should not mirror the complexity observed in the evolutionary histories of other mammals during that time period. And this illustrates that complexity. They are indeed correct It was complex. So this is a map of the Mediterranean area. And these arrows, the different colors refer to different dispersal events in time. The reds are earlier dispersal events, the blues are intermediate in time, and the greens are later in time. And it basically shows that there have been comings and goings between Africa and Eurasia for millions and millions of years. And there are multiple samples of great apes living in the middle and late Miocene, and those are represented by these ovals and circles with different colors. Over this time period, there's a large amount of information um, available for the fossil in the fossil record of Europe and Western Asia at this time. But I'm going to focus, if we look at this bright um, straight arrow, greenish arrow, whatever color that is, sorry. We're going to focus on the new Anatolian fossils that have recently been described and that I had the pleasure of being involved with, which I think represent some of the best evidence of the presence of the African ape and human lineage, the hominines, in the Miocene outside of Africa. Here's a map of the same region, but a little bit closer up, that shows the distribution of the Eastern Mediterranean, Western Asian sites that contain the Antediluvius and the taxa that are closely related to Antediluvius, Gracopithecus and Oranopithecus. So again, I don't know if you can see any pointers here, but towards the right, there's the site of Asmaka in Bulgaria. Then a little bit lower down, Ravan de la Pluie and Tsirochori, and then Nikiti. Those are sites that contain, and then further down, further down in southern Greece is Pyros Vasilicis. Those are sites that contain Oranopithecus and Gracopithecus, ranging in age from about 9.5 million years ago for the Oranopithecus sites and about 7.2 million years ago for the Gracopithecus sites. Intermediate in age, moving east towards Chorakyala, is the site from which Antediluvius is found. And as I said, it's intermediate in age between Oranopithecus and Gracopithecus. There are a few other sites that are listed here. Just below Chorakyala is Sinap, which is a site that has a Pongine, an orang ancestor from Anatolia. Further to the east, a little in Georgia, is Udapno, which has a Dryopithecine, has something similar to the Western and Central European great apes. And then below Udapno is a site called Marageh, which is in Iran. And there are two teeth from Marageh. We don't know what they are because the sample isn't big enough. They could be something related to the orangs, or they could be something related to the African apes and humans. We need more fossils to determine what they are. So let's look at Antediluvius in a little bit more detail. Antediluvius, as I said, does provide some of the strongest evidence for the presence of Miocene apes outside of Miocene hominines, Miocene African ape human lineage members outside of Africa. The site of Chorakyala was first described in the 1960s, but no fossil apes were found. By 2023, after the more modern techniques of excavation were established, over 5,000 identifiable fossils were discovered. Among these are at least 5 individuals of an ape. This ape was named on the basis of a more limited sample in 2007, Oranopithecus turci, but has recently been renamed Antediluvius turci. And the new evidence is basically from this beautifully preserved skull, which you can see in 3 views: a view of the palate on the left, a side view, and then a view of the face on the right. Antediluvius is, as I mentioned before, from Çorakyalar in Turkey, and it's 8.7 million years old. Based on these 5,000 or so well-preserved identifiable fossils, we can reconstruct the environment as having been a dry forest or even a savanna in places, with typical East African or African um, uh, animals living in grasslands and dry forests, like antelopes, giraffes, hyenas, zebras, etc. Uh, Organopithecus is almost certainly related to, Anodiluvius is almost certainly related to Organopithecus, as both Pew and our phylogeny recovers. We think that Anodiluvius, like Organopithecus, was a hard or tough object feeder, powerful jaws, large teeth, really massive attachment sites for the muscles, the chewing muscles, and its large size and its environment suggest to us that it was likely to be terrestrial, although we do need more postcrania to explore that hypothesis more completely. Just a few more pictures of Anodiluvius. This is on the right, on the left, sorry, is a male mandible with a relatively small canine, the first tooth on the right side of the tooth row. The middle image is of a female. These are not to scale. The female is considerably smaller than the male. And then on the right is the palate that is the type specimen of Anodiluvius, the one that was published in 2007. So I don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail on the morphology and the details of our analysis of Anodiluvius, but I'll just point out a few things. First of all, it has hyperthick enamel, similar to the thickness of enamel in Australopithecines. It has a broad, flat cusped post-canines, in other words, premolars and molars, and these are some of the reasons that we think that it was a hard, tough object feeder. We were able to use micro-CT scanning to visually extract or virtually extract the teeth from their mandible. So on the left, you see three images of the first premolar, the second premolar in the middle, and the first lower molar on the bottom from that jaw of that male Anodiluvius that I showed you before. And it allows us, without removing the teeth, it allows us to visualize the morphology of the roots. And again, without going into a lot of detail, we find that the root configuration, the relationship of the roots to each other, how they're connected to each other, where they branch off, how they branch off, this configuration is shared with Gracopithecus, that younger Balkan hominin, and also with some, but not all, Pliopleistocene hominids. If we look over to the right, we see a bunch of palates in cross-section, upper jaws in cross-section, and the highlighted area, the area in the box, is Anodiluvius, the fossils, and then drawings of them above them. And they have a configuration of the maxilla and the premaxilla, the front part of the jaw and the roof of the palate, that look most like a gorilla. They certainly look more like hominin, African ape and humans, than they look like orangs. Orangs are on the top right column there, which have a unique configuration of the front part of the jaw and the back part of the jaw. So, and they also have reduced canines. Anodiluvius has smaller canines than even Organopithecus, but not as small as later hominins like Ardipithecus. So basically, the take-home message here is that we have this taxon with unexpectedly modern African ape and even possibly hominin attributes in terms of root and root canal morphology and in terms of premaxillary morphology and canine size. Okay, so getting back to my gene pools here, my population pools, in this scenario, and of course I recognize again that it's one of at least two and possibly more possible scenarios, but in this scenario, hominins radiate in Europe and disperse into Africa before 7 million years ago. So in other words, there is an event where an ancestor moves into Europe and evolves into this wonderful radiation of different hominins. these darker blue, darker green ones first, then the lighter green ones later on. Darker blue with Hispanopithecus, Rudopithecus, etc. I'm sorry, darker green, and then lighter colored green with Greco-Pithecus, Anadaluvius, and Organopithecus. All of this happens in Europe. Meanwhile, the orang lineage is evolving on its own in Asia. So this illustrates this first sequence of events with something like Afropithecus, which is a well-known taxon from Kenya that's about 17.5 million years old. Some descendant of Afropithecus moves following this lower red arrow into Eurasia, where it evolves into Gryphopithecus, which is present in Anatolia in two different localities, and in the Vienna Basin, which is on the yellow dot just above Gryphopithecus, and then also in Bavaria, which is the dot further to the west. Gryphopithecus and Afropithecus share robust jaws, powerful chewing muscles, thickly enameled teeth. So we think that the reason that Afropithecus was able, or a descendant of Afropithecus was able to disperse into Europe is because of this enhanced masticatory or chewing apparatus that allowed it to exploit a wider range of resources and allowed it to move or disperse further to the north. Once in Europe, the Dryopithecines, which you can see on the top left, diversify into a large number of different forms of positional behavior, some more quadrupedal, some more suspensory, one form even potentially an arboreal biped, wide variety of different kinds of things that flourish in Europe from about 12.5 million, or the fossil record at least is from 12.5 million to about 9.5 million years ago. But eventually, these soft fruit-eating dryopiths, as we call them, disperse to the south in response to changing climatic conditions, and they eventually evolve. They evolve into the Greco-Pithecines, which are the more thickly enameled taxa that include Organopithecus, Anadaluvius, and Greco-Pithecus that occur later in time. So to summarize that, Rudopithecus, which is a well-known taxon from Central Europe, from Hungary, and others from Spain, they're basically chimp-like, suspensory, forest-living, soft fruit-eating animals that we refer to as the Dryopithecines. Progressively, the back teeth, the postcanines, the premolars and the molars get larger. The canines get smaller. This is in this blue arrow on the top. This vertical, the frontal bone becomes more vertical. The chewing muscles become greatly enlarged, and all the attachment sites are very prominent. And also the front part of the jaw gets larger and more robust, and that leads to Organopithecus and Anadaluvius, which, as you can see here, are Australopithecine, more Australopithecine-like. They're by no means exactly like Australopithecines, but they have resemblances to Australopithecines. They're terrestrial, they live in open country settings, and they're hard, tough object feeders, and we call them the Greco-Pithecines. We think that they're reasonably interpreted as related to similar looking hominins that appear in Africa 7 million years ago, such as Sahelanthropus on the upper right, which may or may not be a hominin. This is becoming increasingly a subject of debate, but certainly Ardipithecus, which is much later in time, which you can see here below Sahelanthropus, which is clearly a hominin, at least in my opinion. So here's another way of looking at it. I'll just go over this quickly. As a good cladist, or somebody who works on phylogeny, numerical approaches to phylogeny, we don't really like to place our fossils directly in line to anything. Bernard actually alluded to this as well. yesterday. So Antidiluvius for me is probably a sister taxon, so it's his first branch off here, which means that it shares a common ancestor with the African apes and humans. But it is also possible, and we explore these alternatives in our article on Antidiluvius, that it could be on the line leading to chimpanzees and bonobos in the middle, and humans on the top. It's also possible that it's an early member of the gorilla clade. We need more fossils to evaluate those hypotheses more generally. But the bottom line is it is an early member of the African ape and human clade or lineage, and it was living in Turkey and not in Africa. We propose that the Gracopithecines, or descendants of the Gracopithecines, disperse into Africa between 7 and 8 million years ago and represent the population from which the hominines evolved. Um, the most likely scenario is that the separate lineages of hominines did, in fact, separate and evolve in Africa. But again, there is some evidence to suggest that some of these lineages might have diverged before entering Africa. We need more fossils to explore that. Why did hominines move from Southwest Asia to Africa? After all, it is more complicated to say they started out in Africa, they moved into Europe, then they moved back down into the southern parts of Europe, and then they moved back down into Africa. That's more complex than saying everything happened in Africa uh, uh, as a sort of linear progression. That is more complex, but there is evidence to support that hypothesis. Not just the presence of these fossils that look like African apes in Europe and Western Asia. There was a model, an analysis recently published by Böhme, my colleague and good friend, Madeleine Böhme, and colleagues. I'm one of the colleagues involved in this study, that suggests the following model. We know from geologic studies that there was an increase in desiccation or drying out and a reduction in the forest cover in Europe and Western Asia, which at about 7 million years ago led to a peak in dispersals or movements of mammals from the northern parts of this region, in other words, Western Asia, Anatolia, and Central and West and Southern Europe, into Africa. We know this happened because we have the fossil evidence of many different mammals to show it. And we have the geological evidence to show that this drying was occurring. The drying continued to the point where the connection between Africa and Eurasia was cut off. Mammals couldn't go through these desertic areas, and so dispersals were cut off for until about 2.5 million years ago. But then conditions renewed because we know that these conditions are cyclical. Humid conditions came back and allowed for the dispersals between Europe and Africa and Eurasia to renew. And among the dispersals that happened after 2.5 million years ago was probably one that led to the first appearance of humans in Eurasia. I should say
Totally.
that the main study area that was used to document these changes in climate and these alternating humid and dry periods was in the Zagros Mountains, which is, of course, also in Iran.
Sorry, David.
Yeah.
And time is and the time is over.
Oh,
And sorry, yeah.
are you cutting me off?
No, no, no.
You want me to
Just
just finish
one
fast?
to one. Yeah, yeah. Great.
Okay, I will finish fast. This slide just illustrates the fact that at around 7 million years ago, this yellow bar says hominines enter Africa from the eastern Mediterranean, with a large number of other taxa, giraffes, hyenas, bovids, rodents, etc. So the bottom line here says hominines were just following all other mammals that dispersed into Africa. So to conclude very quickly, I urge all researchers to keep an open mind to well-documented hypotheses, as Wood and Harrison had also urged. Avoid oversimplification to traditional explanations, and avoid ad hoc claims of homoplazy or preservation bias, like absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. There is, in fact, abundant evidence of in situ evolution of hominines in Europe and Southwest Asia. Just again to recapitulate, we have this phylogenetic hypothesis. There are no hominins in Africa until 6 or 7 million years ago. The hominins that we do have, hominines that we do have, in Western and in Asia and Europe resemble African apes and humans in many ways. And there is overwhelming evidence of the same dispersal pattern that we're suggesting for apes, among other mammals. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Reza Mehmar Sadehi and the organizing committee and the Tardid Institute for inviting me to participate in Darwin Day in Iran 2024. I'm sorry for going over.